Well, welcome. Tonight's presentation is Natural Approaches to Heart Health. My name is Gaia Kile. I'm a nurse practitioner. I've over 10 years experience working in natural and holistic approaches to disease and health. I got my master's from the University of Michigan in nursing, and I worked for a while as a research associate at the University of Michigan's Complementary and Alternative Medicine Research Center. I have additional training through the Center for Mind-Body Medicine, and I'm a certified therapeutic lifestyle counselor. And I work with Dr. Malcolm Sickles on the west side of town, doing holistic primary care. We're going to be talking about heart disease today. Specifically, we're going to focus more on coronary heart disease, that is to say, disease of the blood vessels that feed the heart. There are other kinds of heart disease, arrhythmias when the beat is off, myocardial disease, disease of the muscle of the heart, and diseases of the valves of the heart. We may touch on some of those a little bit, but really the focus is going to be coronary heart disease, the blood vessels that feed the heart. And that's important. Coronary heart disease kills nearly 500,000 Americans a year, and cardiovascular disease as a whole, since the turn of the century, has been the #1 killer in the United States every year but 1918. Maybe you can guess, with all the swine flu talk, maybe you can guess what happened in 1918. It was the flu, right? I'm going to start by talking about risk factors and some of the kind of dynamics that go into heart disease. We'll talk about metabolic syndrome in particular, which is a conglomerate of things that we see showing up early that give us an indication that someone is on the road to heart disease. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about lifestyle things that people can do, including diet, and some thoughts on different approaches, 3 different diet approaches, and some similarities between all of them, although they look a little different at first. Then at the end, I'm going to be talking some about some specific interventions, specific things people can do in terms of nutrients, specific foods and herbs, and that'll go a little quicker at the end. So when we talk about risk factors, we're talking about things that increase the likelihood of you having coronary artery disease, and there are 3 main ones that are not modifiable, that you don't have any choice over. You don't have any choice over your age, your gender, and your family background. And so your risk goes up after 45 for men and after 55 for women. And your risk is greater if you're a man than a woman, although not tremendously so. And if you have a first-degree relative who has heart disease, that is to say a family member, an immediate family member, a parent, a sibling, or a child, then your risk is higher. And if you're non-white, your risk is higher. I always think that this is Harold Washington, was mayor of Chicago, and I always think he should be the poster child because he actually died of a heart attack at age 60. There's all the risk factors. There are also modifiable risk factors, certainly. Physical inactivity, smoking, weight, blood pressure, cholesterol imbalance, and sugar imbalance, diabetes. So we often look at some additional risk factors that you can get by looking at some blood factors, including high sensitivity CRP, C-reactive protein. This got a lot of press recently because there was a study that showed that, in fact, it does make a difference. Homocysteine, lipoprotein A, and fibrinogen are all factors in how clots form and the nature of those clots. And so looking at those can sometimes be worthwhile, and there's sometimes things you can do about those. And then finally, not a blood factor, but stress becomes a very important risk factor that doesn't get put into that traditional set of main risk factors, but it's certainly increasingly we're seeing an important factor. So what is metabolic syndrome? Metabolic syndrome really is, there's different definitions, but the one I like is a combination of involvement of at least 3 of these 5 markers, these 5 risk factors. Abdominal obesity, so what we're talking about is 100 centimeter waist circumference for men 80 centimeter waist circumference for women. That's at the widest place. People also talk about waist to hip ratio, but certainly that can also be a factor. Altered cholesterol. So in terms of metabolic syndrome, what we see is that specifically if your HDL cholesterol, this is when we measure someone's cholesterol, we see different factors, different elements of the cholesterol. HDL cholesterol, we always say H for happy because it's easy to remember, but it's high density cholesterol. You want that above 40 for men and ideally 50 for women in terms of looking at metabolic syndrome. I start feeling like this is just no fair, right, because the numbers are always higher for women. And then for triglycerides, you want your triglycerides under 150. And when I look at a cholesterol, one of the important numbers is the ratio of the HDL to the total cholesterol. Then blood pressure, when we normally think of does someone have high blood pressure, the numbers we look at are that the top number should be under 140, the bottom number should be under 90. But in terms of metabolic syndrome, we talk about lower numbers. So that top number we want under, depending on who you talk to, 130, 135, the bottom number under 85. So the parameters just are a little tighter when we're talking about metabolic syndrome, but it's the combination of a bunch of them that add together that suggests the risk. And then insulin resistance, what do I mean by that? Insulin is the chemical that your body puts out to drive your sugar out of your blood and into your cells. And when your cells start resisting that process, when they don't take up the sugar as well, then your blood sugar goes up and it wreaks havoc on blood vessels and so on. So we look at insulin resistance, and the numbers we look at are tighter again than the numbers that we would look at for diabetes. So if someone's blood sugar on a fasting case, where we take some of the blood and we see how much sugar it is above 100, then we consider that there's maybe some insulin resistance, and that becomes one of the 3 markers required. And it turns out that if you look at these 5 factors, quite a few people end up meeting the criteria for metabolic syndrome who don't necessarily meet the criteria for heart disease. I always like to refer to this article from the New England Journal of Medicine because I think it's a very important one. This was back in March of 2005, and what it predicted, and it was a predictive article, was that life expectancy would begin to decline. That specifically life expectancy would decline in the United States after a 2-century rise, continual rise in life expectancy. We're now seeing change that people are living shorter than their parents. And the generation that they picked to start really is the generation of my children. And so I feel, kind of defensive of it, like we got to do something about this, right? But the reason for that change all rests on obesity and blood sugar issues in terms of what they were identifying with this article. So let's talk about weight a little bit, right? So how do you measure? Well, what's your weight? Where should it be? Where do you want it to be? We talk about body mass index. Here's a chart that lets one calculate this. It's pretty simple. You find your height along here. So I'm 6'1", and then you come over here and you find your weight, and then you come on up and you get your body mass index. And so it's height, weight, and it's broken down into 3 categories basically. The healthy is under 25. Frankly, I think that depending on what else is going on for you, that might be a little tight. That I might drive the line of under 26, but mincing words, I suppose. And then overweight, and then beyond 30, it's classified as obese. And 1/3 of Americans fall in this category, and another third fall in this category. So fully 2/3 of Americans are part of this epidemic of being overweight. And what's the implications of this? Well, let's take a look at some things. Diabetes. This is just charting out at different body mass indexes along the bottom. This is actually a study of the Pima Indians, but the number of new cases per person years, and you can see that as the body mass index goes up, the diabetes goes up. Here's a study of women utilizing health care. There was kind of a, who walked in the door of a clinic and then take their blood pressure, and you can see again the same pattern, that as the body mass index goes up, the blood pressure goes up. And also with cholesterol. This happens to be a study in rural Japan. There are lots of studies out there with different little populations, and they all pretty much have the same message, that those three factors, as well as your risk of heart disease and death, go up with your weight. But weight and body mass index are not the whole picture. I want to talk a little bit about sarcopenia, which is the loss of muscle mass, and that becomes an important factor. And what I'd say is that you can be a skinny fat person. Similarly, you can be, Arnold Schwarzenegger, at least at his peak, was not at the same kind of risk of heart disease, even though his body mass index put him over the line, because he had a lot of muscle mass relative to fat. So what we do is we look at bioimpedance analysis, and we'll talk about that. So sarcopenia is, this is a quote from the Journal of the American Medical Association. Sarcopenia is the backdrop against which the drama of disease plays out. A body already depleted of protein because of aging is less able to withstand the protein loss that comes with acute illness and inadequate protein intake. So this is a little poster demonstration of someone losing weight two different ways, a healthy way and an unhealthy way. If we look at, so what this is supposed to represent is a little section of the stomach is cut away, and if we compare the two on your left, we see a healthy abdomen with plenty of muscle mass and reduced fat, and on the other side we see the excess fat. Particularly important is that it's the fat, the adipose tissue behind the muscle wall, and that actually acts in some ways that are metabolically important. That is to say, they're important in terms of how they play out in your body's chemistry, and that in a way that's really, that makes it toxic. So if we follow these are the blood vessels, sample blood vessels taken down and expanded from the, I kind of think the poster's funny, but it makes some good points. We can look at what's going on in the blood vessels, and on the left, again, we see the healthy blood pressure, healthy cholesterol, healthy glucose, insulin levels are good, hormones are in balance. And on the other side, where there's the abdomen with the adipose tissue, all those things are off. High blood pressure, high cholesterol, high glucose, excess insulin, and excess, hormones are out of balance. They're all whacked out. Now, why is this important? Well, it is possible to lose weight without gaining muscle mass, and when that happens, you get set up into a bunch of problems, including you're more likely to regain the weight. So we will measure this when we're trying to help people lose weight, because it's a helpful guide. And sometimes people will say, oh, I didn't lose any weight, but then we measure and we say, yeah, but your muscle mass is more. So by doing a bioimpedance test, this is putting a couple electrodes on your wrist, a couple on your ankle, and we're able to, the machine gives us some numbers that we're then able to calculate how much body mass cells, how much muscle mass or fat-free mass, and how much fat. And also it lets us know where water is in your body. So sometimes people just lose water, and that's not what we want to go for either, although sometimes initially that can be part of a process. But so it gives us a closer look at what's actually going on when we're trying to get someone's health status to be a little more robust. In terms of reducing the risks that we can, I want to talk about 3 different eating plans for weight loss and metabolic control, all of which I think have the potential of being beneficial, and then we'll pull some core recommendations out of them. And then I'm going to talk some about ways of maximizing your metabolism. So one is the Mediterranean diet, and we work a lot with actually a modified version of this, kind of a version that has maybe a little more protein than the classic Mediterranean diet. Oh, let me go back to the map. But when you look at this, think about all the good places you can get food from, right? Italy, Greece, Mediterranean food, North African food. So there are a lot of options that in this diet, and again, I mean, not that you have to eat the ethnicities, but all those diets, traditional diets from those places, have the elements that we're looking for. So there are foods from those places that are healthy and can be the basis of a healthy diet. The modified version that we use has some specific elements, number of vegetable servings, 4 or more, 2 to 4 servings of protein, legumes, beans, peas, and so on, getting at least some of that every meal, getting some fruits every day, getting some grain. We actually tend to do reduced grain and relative to the classic Mediterranean diet, but for a lot of people that works well for weight loss. Some nuts and seeds, healthy oils, and dairies, depending on what your calorie goal is, and we set that based on your metabolic rate, which we can calculate fairly easily. This is for a day. Now, when we talk about a serving of protein, we're talking about an area about the size of the palm of your hand. Serving of vegetables, a half cup. And again, the numbers depend, what calorie range you're going for. But another diet that's gotten some popularity recently is the Paleolithic diet. The idea is eat like your ancestors did, eat like a cave person. I think it's worth looking at what this diet has to offer, and a lot of people have done really well on this diet, particularly people who are struggling with diabetes. So you can eat all that you want of lean meats, fish, fruit, leafy vegetables, the cruciferous vegetables, the broccoli family, cabbages, and so on. But I think the other thing that I would say is that if you really want to go for it, you want to get as much as possible grass-fed meats and wild seafoods. And then this diet lets you have a limited amount of some other foods. And then the things that are on the no list are dairy, grains, beans, and sugar, soft drink, processed foods, beer, and all those things that you can probably imagine that I didn't include. And then there's an approach which is the vegan diet. So this is my vegetable eater, which for good results, the following are the kind of 4 recommendations. No animal products at all, including fish, eggs, dairy. A low-fat diet, so you're not pouring a bunch of oil onto everything. And low glycemic foods. We'll talk more about glycemic in a moment, but what that has to do with is what it does to your blood sugar. And then because you're not getting any animal foods, and because we all wash our food more than our ancestors did, we have to get some B12. If we ate more dirt, that would be handled. But so is there no agreement? I love this chart because here we have the high protein diets, which is sort of what the Paleolithic diet is, and to some extent the modified Mediterranean that we do. Here you have the high fiber, and then you have the low fat over here. And so you got these, 2 foods that you can eat, right? The egg white omelet and the black bean chili. But if we talk about the diets I was just talking about, the black bean chili is out for the Paleolithics, and the egg white omelet is out for the true vegans. So what are you going to do? Is there any common ground? I think there actually is. And so what I want to do is share what I think are the common points of these 3 approaches. They all have in common a low glycemic index approach, a reduced or healthy fat intake, and they're all rich in vegetables, and they all believe in the concept of satiety. That is to say, eat until you're full. They all have a you can keep eating if you want to element to them. In the Mediterranean diet, that's most limited in that you can eat more vegetables if you want to, but that's, and actually they even say of a specific kind, the low starch vegetables, so you don't want to say you can eat as many potatoes as you want. So we're going to talk about glycemic index for a second. If we give you a food and then we watch what your blood sugar does over time, you can see that on a high glycemic food, it shoots up and your blood sugar stays up longer. A low glycemic food peaks lower, and then it just it never gets so high, and the amount of sugar that you're exposed to is just over time is less. Well, what happens when your blood sugar shoots up like that? There's a couple of vicious circles that happen. The first vicious circle is my vicious cookie circle, right? You have intake of high sugar food that shoots your blood sugar up. As your blood sugar goes up, your insulin kicks in. Your insulin drives down your blood sugar, and then what does that do? That makes you hungry, and then once you're hungry, it starts all over again with an increased craving. You reach for the second cookie, and you go around the cycle. Meanwhile, so what happens when your insulin drives your blood sugar down? Well, where does it drive it? Excess blood sugar is converted into fat. Should you eat carbs? Should you eat fat? Well, in some ways, they're the same thing, because sugar converts into fat, and fat gets stored in your fat cells, but this was really interesting to me to learn that actually fat cells fill up, and when they're full, they transfer fat to the muscle in the liver. When the muscle has more fat in this muscle cell, it becomes more resistant to insulin. So as it's more resistant to insulin, the sugar can't get driven into it, and your blood sugar stays up. So that's where insulin resistance comes in again. I always think of insulin as the knocking on the door of the cell, right? Knock, knock, knock. Let me bring in some sugar with me. And when you've got enough fat in there, the cell says, no way, we don't want it. And so then your blood sugar stays up. And among the things that blood sugar does is it damages blood vessels. And that's how we get back to heart disease, right? As your cells are more resistant, then because they have more fat, then it takes more insulin, so your body tries to produce more insulin, and eventually you get to the point where your body says, I can't do this anymore. And the pancreas we get pancreas poop out, as I like to say. You can't keep producing it.
Cells die?
Well, to be honest, I don't know the specific physiology, but they just don't produce as much insulin at a certain point. But before that happens even, you get into a situation where your blood sugar is up and you can't get it down, even with your pancreas working the best it can. So glycemic index becomes one key factor. The general elements of what is a high glycemic food, if it tastes sweet, if it's highly processed, and if it's really white, are the three things to look for, right? So white flour, white sugar, white potatoes. I always say you can make an exception for white cauliflower, but generally white foods, highly processed foods. So whenever you process something more, you have to think its glycemic index is going up. So even if you cook your pasta longer, its glycemic index goes up. But certainly processed grains are more than whole grains. And sweet is a guide, but it's not the whole picture. So berries have a much lower glycemic index than candy, even though both might be considered sweet. I probably don't eat enough candy to really understand the difference. But the next thing to think about is fat. And there's a lot of diet gurus who say, well, there was the low-fat myth. Everyone should eat low-fat, and that's the solution. And it didn't work, it was a myth. And this is a chart that really shows that story that low-fat telling everyone to eat low-fat didn't work is also, in a certain sense, a myth. I mean, it probably didn't work because people went and started eating high glycemic foods. But if you look at what happened to fat intake from 1980 to 2000, it climbed. And it climbed right along with carbohydrates and right along with protein and everything else. So part of the point here is we're eating too much of everything. If we look at a variety of diets and the percent fat recommendations, it becomes difficult actually, because Mediterranean diet, well, how much fat are you really getting? It depends on what you're actually eating and so on. But actually, both the Paleolithic and the Mediterranean diet probably have a little less fat than the standard American diet. And that number is calculated from the last chart. The Atkins diet, I think, is very suspect, frankly, and I would advise against it. If it had anything going for it, it was that it had a high protein component that sometimes makes a difference for some people. So the other piece about fat is that all fats are not created equal. And this gets back to why grass-fed meats are better. When we talk about good fats, we want to get plenty of omega-3 fatty acids. We want to generally have monounsaturated fats such as olive oil. And if you are doing saturated fats, the short chain ones are the healthier ones. What are the short chain ones? Well, coconut oil and butter actually have shorter chain saturated fats than your meats typically have. And things to be concerned about, certainly trans fats are, in my mind, poison really. They're not a natural substance, and they're probably wreaking havoc in terms of heart disease. And then certainly being cautious about the saturated fats. So here's where I give you a quick lesson in biochemistry. What is a trans fat and what is an omega? I think sometimes it's helpful to because those words get tossed around all the time, and what do they mean? So I have to explain what a cis fat is as well as a trans fat, and then you'll understand what a trans fat is. In nature we have fats tend to have, when they have unsaturated bonds, that is to say where the two carbons are sharing a bond instead of bonding with two other hydrogens, the orientation tends to be C-shaped, right? Or C like cis. And when we artificially make trans fats to make our margarine thick or what have you, the bend goes the other way. So it's a transverse bend. And your body doesn't know how to make heads or tails of that, and it tends to make a mess of it. All right, so that's cis and trans. When we're talking about omegas, if you have a fat chain, you have the alpha end and the omega end. And from the omega end, each of these bends represents a carbon. You can go back, and at the 3 point, if that's where the first unsaturated bond is, then it's an omega-3 fat. If it's at the 6 point, then it's an omega-6 fat. An unsaturated bond, like the cis fat here where you're sharing, you have so here you can, these are connections between carbon, the lines represent connections between carbon atoms, and here you got two lines, two bonds. That means that each of those carbons could hold another hydrogen if they wanted to. But what it means for the molecule is that the molecule has a little more play there, a little more ability to flop around at that point, or a little more of a bend at that point. So the 3s and the 6s and the 9s we hear talk about a lot. What you want is a good ratio of omega-3s to omega-6s. That gets debated somewhere between 1 to 1 and 4 6s to 1 3. The standard American diet, the ratio is something like 24 to 1. I hear different numbers, but somewhere in that range. So the other common element between these three diets is plenty of vegetables. Vegetables have loads of phytonutrients. Vegetables have fiber. They're lower in fat, and they actually have a good amount of, they have a good omega-3 ratio. I generally encourage people to try to get 5 or more a day. And another way to think about it is to eat a rainbow. And I love this picture because it really shows how beautiful vegetables are. And each one of those colors represents a different phytonutrient. A phytonutrient is a chemical that plants have that are generally healthy for the body. They're not like vitamins that you have to have, but having a variety of them is important. People say 5 fruits and vegetables. I think people should be going for 5 vegetables. And now by a serving, I mean a half cup, right? So that means if you have a cup for lunch and a cup and a half for dinner, that's 5 servings, right? Plus, vegetables can be snacks. I'm going to move into talking some about how to get the most out of your metabolism. The metabolism is your body's capacity to burn calories and ultimately to burn fat. So we'll look at exercise, stress, working with appetite, and then we're going to look at some issues of inflammation and allergies and other disease conditions. The general recommendations are that everyone should be trying to get 30 minutes a day of moderate exercise. What do I mean by moderate? Well, I mean, on a treadmill, it would be, they say between 3 and 4 miles an hour. But I generally think so far that you can feel something's happening. You're either breathing a little bit or you're feeling a little warmer, but that you're still probably able to talk to the person next to you if you're doing it with someone. What's the best kind of exercise, the absolute best kind of exercise in the world? It's right up here. It's the kind that you enjoy the most. So I have these women who are enjoying playing some croquet. But whatever you enjoy doing, that's the best exercise for you because you're going to keep doing it. The 90 minutes a day number really comes from looking at if you're really trying to lose weight, you're probably going to have to do more than 30 minutes a day. 1,000 steps is another way of thinking about it. Some people say, well, I walk some during my day. I don't keep track of it. I'm not sure how much. You can get a little device called a pedometer. You strap it on you and you can get some numbers that way. If you really want to think about metabolism, there's a couple of other things that I would say. One is to start early, because that starts your engine. To do some exercise first thing in the morning. Doesn't have to be a lot, but just something that says, turn on the body, let's get going. Another thing is it doesn't have to be 30 minutes or 90 minutes all at one time. It can be a 10-minute walk here, a 10-minute walk there, and it adds up, and that's generally fine. The other thing in terms of, back to everything we said about body composition and fat versus muscle mass, certainly doing some exercise that's actually strength building, and so this is my weightlifting friend down here, helps build muscles. Muscles then are the engines of metabolism. Muscles are what burn energy, burn calories. The more muscle you can build, the more active your metabolism becomes. Sometimes that really is the key. Just get a little muscle going and it revs up your engines a little more. So another thing is rest and relaxation. Cortisol is a stress hormone that your body puts out. If we look at metabolic syndrome, remember this chart from earlier in the talk, well, here's what prolonged elevated cortisol does. Not necessarily a short burst of cortisol, but a prolonged rise in cortisol. Increases abdominal fat, alters cholesterol, it lowers the good cholesterol, it raises the LDL, or the lousy cholesterol as we like to call it. It raises your blood pressure and it elevates your blood sugar. It creates insulin resistance. You know, one way you might think about it is it's the response for famine. And so, but now we have stress without famine. And so that's kind of wreaks havoc because we get as many calories as we want. Well, in fact, a lot of people use calories as a response to stress, but which, if it's a response to famine, makes sense, right? I mean, what would you do? You'd want to have craving calories be a response, but unfortunately, our refrigerators are all full. A couple of other things about resting and relaxation. Sleep is very important to heart health. It's also very important to losing weight. People who don't sleep as much tend to gain more weight. I talk to a lot of people about the importance of breathing. Breathing is a great way to do stress reduction. It can lower your blood pressure. It improves your oxygen capacity, so your blood carries oxygen better. It improves your resilience in terms of heart risk. There's actually a device called Respirate, which is a biofeedback device. So you strap it around your waist and you put these earphones on and it monitors how you're breathing and it gets you to breathe a little slower. And by getting you to breathe a little slower, it can actually lower your blood pressure. The recommendations from that machine, which I'd say, well, you don't need to get the machine if you can get into the habit of doing the breathing, is get your breathing under 10 breaths a minute for a period of 15 minutes, 3 times a week. And after 8 weeks, their studies consistently found that they could get people's blood pressure to drop. So appetite control, right now, I do think it's important to say the diets that I think are most successful are ones that aim for satiety, aim for you're full, you're not hungry, you're not craving. Some of the key elements for making that happen include getting a good breakfast. Breakfast is the most important meal of the day. People who eat more healthy, substantial breakfast end up eating less calories throughout the day than people who skip breakfast. Eating frequent small meals. Again, I think of this as like adding kindling to a fire, right? If you ever seen a fire where you got this big log that's kind of smoldering along and there's some coals there, but it's not really burning, and then you stick some kindling under there, that gets the big log burning also. So every time you eat something, you're kicking in your metabolism. And so getting frequent healthy meals, I often say try to eat every 3 hours so you get a snack or something, a healthy snack to kick that in. Some attention needs to be given to portion size. There are some wonderful statistics about, and that fat chart that I showed you that showed the increased fats gives you a sense of it, but there's some wonderful statistics about how much more we're eating now than we were eating 10, 20 years ago. So getting that under control, part of that is to eat regularly so you're not always famished, but part of that is to also say, when's enough's enough. Then the kind of food elements to think about: low glycemic, getting plenty of fiber. Fiber is long-chain carbohydrates that your body isn't able to break down and use as carbohydrates or as energy. The omega-3 fatty acids play an important role. Protein can have a lot to do with feeling full, satiety, and that sense of I've eaten enough, so sometimes protein can be important. Then finally, I think getting adequate fluid is important, and volume is an interesting question. Fiber plays into that some, but there was an interesting study where a nutritionist took a dish. She figured out how to make a casserole and a soup out of the same thing, and so the soup had more volume, and she fed one group of people the soup, the same amount of food of soup, and another group of people the same amount of food of casserole, but it was less volume, right? And then half an hour later, let them eat whatever they wanted. And what she found was that the group that ate the soup, the larger volume, were more full, ate less a half an hour later. So volume is an interesting thing to look at, and just a kind of a little tip to throw in there. This is back to the breakfast issue. The sumo wrestler diet. What do sumo wrestlers do to gain all their mass? They skip breakfast, they eat late in the day, they eat a lot, but they exercise a lot, but they eat a lot, and they sleep after eating. But skipping breakfast and sometimes they'll skip lunch too, is an important part of their strategy. And if they do eat lunch, they take a nap afterwards. So you don't want to eat and then go right to bed. You want to give your metabolism, because when you go to bed, you're telling your metabolism, okay, time to turn off. You want to give your metabolism a chance to use some of those calories when you put them into you. So there's some other issues to look at too. Sometimes you do all the lifestyle things right and things just aren't moving. And it's at that point that I start thinking about, well, are there some other things going on? Is there some inflammation? So we look at different sources. Is your C-reactive protein up? We talked about that earlier on. Is there a source for the inflammation? Are there some toxins that are causing some inflammation? Or are there allergens? Or is there a chronic disease issue that may come into play? If your C-reactive protein is up, it suggests that there's some inflammation. So C-reactive protein is a measure of inflammation. High sensitivity is just the specific lab form that we look at it because it has more of it's more accurate and it has more of a heart health implications. There are other things you can look at to measure inflammation, but that's the one because of its heart connection that we usually look at. So certainly in terms of disease conditions, oftentimes hormones are the issue. So it's worth looking at thyroid, particularly for weight gain, particularly if you start having sudden unexplained weight gain, but sometimes if it's been chronic weight gain. And one thing I'd like to point out about thyroid numbers, just in the last year or two actually, the American Academy of Clinical Endocrinologists changed their statistic, their number, their lab value for at what point do you say someone has hypothyroid, so that they now are saying a larger group of people would be considered hypo or low thyroid. And if your thyroid is really the hormone that is the governing factor for your metabolism. There are other hormone issues that can come into play. If your adrenal glands are worn out, you may not have any energy to do exercise. You may not, and it can affect metabolism also. Estrogen and testosterone, actually they both, having adequate estrogen and testosterone, both have important implications for heart health. And it's not uncommon at all when women go through menopause and their estrogen drops, that at that point they start gaining weight. And so sometimes we need to look at that and estrogen replacement got a bad name from the Women's Health Study that was looking at synthetic estrogens and synthetic progestins, not progesterone, which is what your body makes. And if we work with the natural ones, there's good reason to believe that they may be actually fairly safe. And we do a fair amount of that. I want to kind of finish up with talking some about some additional approaches, additional things that can be done for heart health and for protection, specifically around some of those risk factors. So we'll talk about metabolic factors and cofactors. We'll talk about protecting the cell lining of your blood vessels, the endothelium. We'll talk about balancing the minerals in your body, and then some key nutrients. And finally, we'll talk about foods and herbs. So CoQ10, I'm guessing most people here have at least heard of CoQ10. That's probably the most popular of the nutrients that really work with the metabolism of the cell. But L-carnitine and D-ribose also are key players in how the cell burns energy. So the cell has something called a mitochondria in it. It's a little part of the cell where actually energy gets generated and gets made usable for the body. And these three factors play an important role. I think there's good reason to believe that they may be helpful for blood pressure. They can help insulin resistance. They can be beneficial for angina, that is to say the chest pain related to heart disease. They can actually help with certain arrhythmias, that is to say when the heart isn't beating at a rate that's appropriate. CHF is congestive heart failure, and even some evidence that they may be helpful for valve disease, or like when sometimes the valves between the different chambers of the heart get floppy, they don't close properly, and then you get backflush of blood, so they can help with that too. What's the endothelium? That's a big word, but it refers to the cell lining of the blood vessel. So this is a cutaway blood vessel, and you can see the healthy endothelium, and here's an endothelium that's gotten some cracks in it, and when it gets cracks in it, all the stuff underneath it goes into play to try to protect the blood vessel, and that creates the plaques or the clots that then set you up for heart disease. There's various things you can do to think about to improve your endothelium. If there's one single thing to think about, it would be the amino acid arginine. Arginine is part of your body's, part of the way your body releases nitrous oxide, which your body needs to allow the blood vessels to remain flexible, essentially, to dilate, to open up, to let more blood through. And so arginine, I use it a lot to try to help people lower their blood pressure. It probably improves insulin sensitivity. There are studies showing it reducing the risk and the symptoms of heart disease. It actually can reverse erectile dysfunction and may help increase muscle mass, and it may actually make those plaques, those clots that are forming, get smaller. It's a supplement, right? And probably we're thinking 3 to 6 grams, so that's a fair amount, but it's fairly cheap. So that we're talking maybe $15 a month. Electrolytes are important for a bunch of things. These three, magnesium, calcium, and potassium, are important when you're thinking about blood pressure. People talk a lot about salt and blood pressure, and there's a sense in which that's true, right? If you get too much salt, your blood pressure can go up, and some of that actually goes back to whether your arginine is working well enough, which is a longer story, which I don't know that I even can replicate the biochemistry there, but the other part of the equation is how much sodium relative to these three other minerals. And in terms of importance, I would kind of go down the list that magnesium is the most important, and potassium is the one you have to be most careful about, because too much potassium can get you into heart trouble. But working with these three can sometimes bring down blood pressure. Magnesium is good for heart health in other senses. Again, the prolapsed valves it can help with. It can help with conductivity, and probably overall reduces the risk of heart disease, separate from its beneficial effects. Chromium, we use a fair amount for people who are insulin resistant. Start with a small amount and go up and up until you start getting some results. Ideally, we work with polynicotinate. Part of that is because the nicotinate part of that is works synergistically with the chromium part of that in terms of increasing insulin sensitivity, that is to say, increasing how well the inside of the cell can hear when insulin comes knocking. Chromium also can be used to lower LDL cholesterol, or the lousy cholesterol. So chromium is another nice one. Key foods to think about: omega-3 fatty acids. We classically say fish oil because you want ideally the longer chain omega-3 fatty acids. We talked about what an omega-3 fatty acid was before, but they do all kinds of things. They protect against cardiovascular disease and strokes. They improve how your blood flows. So people talk about blood thinners. Actually, that term, although isn't a technical term for what blood thinners do, is associated with a set of chemicals. And omega-3 fatty acids work by a slightly different mechanism. So what they really do is they help viscosity. They help keep the cells flowing easier so that you're less likely to clot. And clots, of course, being the thing that sets you up for a heart attack. They decrease inflammation. And so remember all that endothelial stuff. Inflammation is a key part of what sets that in motion. So they can also decrease your C-reactive protein, right? They reduce the risk of the irregular heart, and they slow plaque buildup. They slow the buildup of clots in your blood vessels. So, and this is just a partial list of the things they do, but it's kind of some of the key things that they do in terms of heart health. So getting some regular fish oil, the key things to say is you want to make sure you're getting a good product, because there's a lot of fish oil that's rancid. You got to watch out for mercury, but to get some omega-3 fatty acids on board is a good idea. So there are products out there where you can get DHA is a little easier than the EPA, although for inflammation the EPA is probably more important. Disclosure, I mean, I'm a vegan, and so what I do is I go for the DHA from an algae source, and then I try to make sure that I get plenty of the ALA, or the shorter chain omega-3 fatty acids, and hope that they convert in enough number to the EPA, which are the mid-length between the two. If you're looking for a vegan source, I mean, flaxseed is probably the best thing to think about. What you want to do is keep it refrigerated or even froze and grind it before using it. I don't use an algae per se, I use a product that is algae-derived DHA. So a couple of other condition-specific things that the omega-3 fatty acids do. They balance cholesterol, they lower your blood pressure, they protect against insulin resistance, and they can help reduce body fat. So it's interesting that a strategic fat, properly taken, can actually get your metabolism going so that you actually burn more fat. In terms of vitamins, certainly niacin is sometimes even very conventionally used to lower the LDL cholesterol, but it also raises the HDL cholesterol, so it does both. The other B vitamins to think about are B5 and B6. B5 can lower LDL cholesterol. B6 can help bring down a blood pressure. Probably, or I think that some of that B6 and blood pressure has to do with supporting the adrenal glands and helping your stress symptoms get under control. Vitamin D, D3 in particular, if you're low, which most of us are, the more low you are, the more likely vitamin D will help to bring down your blood pressure. And also certainly there's some increasing body of research to suggest that it protects against cardiovascular disease generally. So vitamin D3 gets formed in our body by sunlight. The problem with, well, modern life, right, is we live indoors, we wear clothes, and at this part of the world, during much of the year, the sun doesn't even get high enough so that we can get sufficient or adequate rays to get that conversion happening. Vitamin K can help with insulin issues, diabetes, and blood sugar issues. And then there's another group of vitamins. C and E really work as antioxidants. So what they do is they provide some protection for blood vessels. C also is important in the forming of collagen, which is part of what makes us a strong endothelium, that kind of inner layer of the cells. But as antioxidants, they balance out what are called free radicals, or things that can do damage to your cells. And when you look at vitamin E, if you look at the research is mixed. You'll see one study, it looks, oh yeah, it did great, and here's another study, it didn't do anything for the heart. And what it turns out is that probably, although the reporting is not great, so it's sometimes difficult to tell, it comes down to whether you're getting the full E complex or if you're just getting D-alpha tocopherol. So that vitamin E actually there's 8 chemicals that are in vitamin E that make up what we call vitamin E. They're all tocopherols and tocotrienols. But so if you're getting an E product, if you're going for a supplement, you want something that has mixed tocopherols. And ideally it should tell you how much, because otherwise maybe it's just, oh yeah, we'll mix a dropperful in with this big vat, right? So buyer beware, right? And alpha lipoic acid has some good evidence around diabetes and blood sugar issues, around cholesterol. So that's one to think about sometimes. So talking about specific foods and herbs for high blood pressure: celery, 4 stalks a day; garlic, 4 cloves a day, if you can handle it. Hawthornberry is probably the herb that first comes to mind for high blood pressure. For cholesterol, certainly getting soluble fibers such as oat bran. Garlic can lower your LDL cholesterol. Plant sterols are often found in soy products, can be good for lowering cholesterol. The last 2, red yeast rice extract is kind of an ancient Chinese approach to cholesterol that has a number of things that come into play. It actually has some naturally found statins, which are the common drugs, but it's in such a small amount that I don't worry about it the way I worry about the statin drugs. And then gugolipids are out of the Indian pharmacopoeia and I think it's a tree resin, although I'm not really sure, but those are some of the things that we sometimes use for lowering LDL cholesterol. And then in terms of raising your HDL cholesterol, lecithin can be helpful. Lecithin is part of the answer to why are eggs good or bad, this debate that happens. Eggs good, bad for your heart. Well, the egg yolks have a lot of cholesterol in them. Maybe that's not so good, but they have a lot of lecithin in them. And then again, soluble fiber can also help with raising HDL cholesterol. So then when we talk about blood sugar, couple of foods: cinnamon and rye. An herb that I like is uva ursi, bearberry. Makes a decent tea. The take-home messages, if you will, or the things to remember. Metabolic syndrome leads to heart disease. Metabolic syndrome, I mean that whole cluster of things: high blood pressure, high triglycerides, low HDL cholesterol, insulin resistance. Things you can do: you can try to get a diet that's got low glycemic foods, healthy fats, variety of vegetables, and try to eat frequent smaller meals. Exercise regularly, including something that's working to build muscle mass. Do some things to control your stress, and then fish oil and other specific key supplements can help. All right, any questions? I have not. The risk, if there is one with fish oil, and it generally is with taking large amounts of fish oil, is a potential for bleeding issues, right? And certainly if you're taking even any amount of fish oil, and you're planning on going into surgery, it may not be a bad idea to at least talk to your surgeon about that. But classically, if you're doing that much, the way it'll present is either a bloody nose or a tendency towards bruising, increased bruising. How would it cause dizziness, right? I would push her for a mechanism and make sure she's not just kind of, well, I'm going to reach for a straw and that's a nice one, right? Usually when I'm kind of a general dose, I'd say look for about 1 gram of the omega-3 fatty acids, right? So not 1 gram of fish oil per se, but it should list EPA and DHA and how much of each of those in milligrams, and it should add up to about a gram's worth to 2 grams, right? I mean, that would be my, and again, if you're just kind of, you want to take a little fish oil, sure, 500 milligrams probably is going to, better than nothing. And look for a fish oil that has some third-party certification that it's, of quality is usually a good idea. And then if you want to test it, poke a hole in one of those things and see if it smells rancid. And if it's smelling really rancid, you got crap, and you should just flush it down the toilet, because it's already turned into free radicals and things that are going to cause you problems. It's an oxidation process, so depending on how it's packaged, yeah, and stored, right? I mean, so keeping your fish oils refrigerated or even frozen are going to keep them good longer. And the nice thing about freezing them is that, or even refrigerating them to some extent, is that it, you know, a lot of people complain about, oh, I get these fishy burps, or I don't like the kind of aftertaste or whatever. If they're frozen, they're less likely to do that for you. So. Rye, in terms of all the grains, rye has something in it that helps your body become more insulin sensitive, so better sugar regulation. It's probably good. You know, B is really tricky. B12 is really tricky because there are a bunch of different things that are B12 cyanocobalaminanes and different carrier molecules that they have, and they probably work differently in the body. And so I've heard some people critique the B12 in yeast. Frankly, I think that if you are being a vegan, it's not a bad idea to just get your B12 checked every once in a while, and then you'll find out if it's working for you or not. I mean, I think the B12 can also be tricky in terms of absorption generally, and so you know, getting it checked, you'll get the answer to that. Right? I think that seaweed is an okay source. I mean, it can be a good source of potassium. And the first question is, what do you need, right? And so if you're trying to bring your blood pressure down, you want to get kind of more minerals in your diet, well, certainly, you know, cutting out sodium, but getting some potassium from sea vegetables, and you're going to get, I mean, you know, if you eat lots of, I mean, if you're a vegan, if you're eating lots of vegetables, there's probably you're getting more magnesium than the average American, right? Which is part of why I say magnesium is so important, because the average American diet has way less magnesium. But even that said, some of it is soil quality, right? So, yeah, if something's gone rancid, I consider it worse than doing nothing. Yeah. Thanks for coming.